Thanks to Aunt Peachy for all her work on preserving the Rolf side of the family history. Because we can trace the Rolf family back to when they immigrated from Germany, my mom and I were interested in Grandma Virginia's side of the family. My mom, Ella Jean Virginia Rolf Cassidy Mahalko, didn't know much about her mom's family, so I went digging. Luckily for me, I had a friend, Ella Lou, who does genealogy, and she agreed to help me. I have a feeling had I been more interested when I was younger, that Aunt Sis and Uncle Bob and Bill could have shed a light on a lot of the history. I'm hoping that some of you older cousins who watch this can fill in some of the gaps and maybe add some stories. So here's some of Virginia Hershman's family tree. I was able to trace it back pretty far until the 1700s, where we immigrated from Germany. I'm going to do that in a different video for everyone because it's a lot of history to go through and it gets confusing pretty fast. But we can trace this back, and we have some interesting folks in our family. Finding Virginia's actual birth date was interesting. On every document it's different. The census records, her children's birth records, her social security card, her death certificate. I was told that Virginia was adopted and she didn't know when her birthday really was. Turns out, after some research, this is half true. West Virginia didn't start issuing birth certificates until 1917, and by 1925, most babies had a certificate. I found Virginia here in the Register of Births in 1905. She wasn't named as of yet, but this is definitely her. And here she is again in the 1910 census. The names are horribly spelled, at the mercy of the census taker in those days. She is 5 years old and listed as Valley V. Hershman. The next document Virginia shows up in is the 1920 census. Here's where the story takes a turn. Virginia is listed as a servant in the previous slide to the artist family in 1920 at the age of 15. So what happened? How did she end up there? Here we're looking at Virginia's parents, Levi Lee Hershman and Lizzie Elizabeth Liller, married on February 7, 1896. This is Elizabeth Liller's family tree. Virginia and Valley are the same person on this tree, I believe. This is her father's family tree, well, part of it anyway. His goes back a long way, to around the 1700s. Again, Valley and Virginia are the same person here. So we're looking at the actual 1910 census here. Levi Hershman and Lizzie had 3 children. Albert Raymond Hershman, born in 1898, Teresa, born February 9, 1901, and Virginia, who we now know was born in 1905. As well as her date of birth being all over the place on documents, so is her name. She can be found as Valley, Violet, Virginia Faith, or just Virginia. This is Teresa Hershman, Virginia's sister's birth register. You can see Teresa at the bottom of the page and the top of the page of the date of 1901. In 1910, in the Sun Bureau paper, Levi got a patent for a railway device. As luck would have it, I have a friend who works for the patent office, and he was able to find the actual patent for me. Here is the patent that Levi Lee Hershman got from the patent office in 1911. My friend wasn't able to tell me much more about it, if any licensing had been done, but I thought it was super cool that this man went to the trouble to get a patent. So from a newspaper article from 1916, you can read that Miss Elizabeth Hershman was granted a divorce. In 1913, the children would have been Albert 15, Teresa 12, and Virginia 8. Assuming that the children stayed with their mother until 1916 when the divorce was granted, That would have made the kids Albert 18, Teresa 15, and Virginia 11. Lizzie Elizabeth Liller would have been 37 years old in 1916 when the divorce was finalized. I found her birth register for 1879. On August of 1917, Levi Lee Hershman married again to Addie Bell Cartwright. They had one son, Wesley, on July 28, 1919. Here in the 1920 census, you can see Lizzie Hershman is shown living in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and listed as a widow and a housekeeper. Her youngest daughter, Virginia, in the 1920 census, is listed as a servant to the artist family. In the 1920 census, Albert Hershman, Virginia's brother, is living in Alexandria, Virginia, and working as a welder. And he is married. In 1925, Albert and his wife Marie are on a ship passenger manifest sailing from Cuba to Key West, Florida. I find Elizabeth Lizzie Liller Hershman a most interesting character in our family history. My mom had some old family paperwork, and a deed to land in Florida was sold to Lizzie in 1926 for $10. I'm still searching for Virginia and Hershman Rolf's marriage certificate. By the census records, I am assuming they got married in 1927, and their first child was born in 1928, Aunt Sis. I have yet to find a paperwork trail, but I'll keep looking. This article is from the July 9, 1929 Miami Herald. I'm not 100% sure this is Elizabeth Lizzie Hershman, but the timeline adds up, and we know she was in Florida to purchase land 3 years prior. I'm 90% sure this is her. In the 1930 census, you can see that Virginia and Harm are married and they have one child, Eileen, age 2. In 1932, Virginia has twin boys, Bobby and Billy. The interesting thing here is how her name is written on the birth certificate, Violet Faith Virginia Hershman. I don't have birth certificates for all the kids, but it would be interesting to see how her name changes on each one. In the 1940 census, Harm and Virginia are living at the farm, and they have 4 kids, Eileen, Bill and Bob, and Jackie. The 1940 census of Virginia's sister Teresa and her husband John Green living in Laurel, Maryland. Look who is living with them, their mother, Elizabeth Hershman. Elizabeth's age is also incorrect here, and I believe she is 61 in 1940. In 1942, Harm had to register for the World War II draft. They upped the age limit for the draft from ages 18 to 37, and Harm was 37. In 1943, Virginia's brother Albert passes away. What's interesting here is his half-brother Wesley is listed in the survivors. So obviously the Hershman children knew where their father Levi was and his second family, and were conceivably close. In 1943, Virginia's father, Lee Levi Hershman, dies. He was 73. What's interesting to note here in his death certificate is how the name Hershman changes over different documents. You can find it spelled many ways. Hershman with a U, Hershman with an E, Hershman with a C. It goes back pretty far to our German heritage, to Heichmann, but that's another story. In 1943, I also think that Virginia's mother, Elizabeth Liller dies, but I haven't been able to find paperwork for that. There is a graveyard, supposedly where she's married in Preston, West Virginia, and I'm gonna try and check that out sometime. In 1952, Floyd Artis dies. This is the family that Virginia is named as a servant to in the 1920 census. It seems the family grew to love her and count her as one of their own at some point. She is listed as a foster daughter, and her children are listed as foster grandchildren in the obituary of Floyd Artis. In 1960, Hershman Rolf is killed in a tractor accident at the farm. Virginia is then 55 years old and has one 16-year-old daughter at home. In 1960, I believe Virginia was able to receive Social Security benefits from the death of her husband. What's interesting to note here is her birth date is once again the wrong year. It should be 1905. In 1969, Lawrence Artis passes away. In his obituary, Virginia is listed as his foster sister. Virginia is now 64, and that's a picture of her in the center in 1969. And that's me, Wendy, the narrator, on her lap. In 1975, Virginia's sister Teresa passes away. Teresa Hershman Green. That's a picture of her and her husband John on the right, with Virginia with her arm around her, and Uncle Bill and Aunt Peach in the picture. Aunt Peachy has lots of descriptions as John and Teresa, as she lived very close by to them in Laurel. On October 7th, 1976, Virginia Faith Rolf passes away. Since I don't think Virginia knew her actual birth date, the one on her death certificate is not correct, off by 2 years, but the month and the day are correct. So it would have made her 71 at the time of her passing, of hardening of the arteries. So here's my takeaway from going on this little history jaunt. It's unclear where or who Virginia was with from 1913 to 1920. 1913 is when her father separated from the family. In 1916, her parents were granted a divorce, and by 1917, her father was remarried. In 1920, she was living with the Artis family and listed as a servant. Now, it wasn't uncommon in that time period to live with another family and do work for them if it was closer to a school where you could continue your education. This is conjecture on my part, but it seems plausible. Also in 1920, Lizzie, Virginia's mother, is living in Atlantic City and listed as a widow. I imagine that was much easier to be listed as a widow than a divorcee at the time. It seems to me Lizzie was done being a family woman and wanted to strike out on her own to find a better life for herself. 2 of her children were old enough to be on their own, and unfortunately, hard choices for Virginia were made. There are a lot of family rumors about one thing or another, but I enjoy finding most of the paper trail here. Virginia was never officially adopted, but I believe the Artis family came to love her and treat her as one of their own. And it makes sense that she was unsure of her birth date. If you were 8 and no one was around to tell you it was your birthday, I would imagine you would forget it after a bit.